Thrown out before winter, he built a cordwood cabin for $4. Halvor Knutson, who had survived 11 Wisconsin winters and buried two brothers to the cold, told him plainly, "A man alone cannot raise walls before the freeze. You will die out there, and no one will find your body until spring." He had $4, no family within 1,000 miles, and needed walls he could not raise alone. On January 7th, 1873, the temperature dropped 50 degrees in 4 hours. But 5 months earlier, Arne Sletback had never built anything larger than a milking stool in his life. He arrived in Oconto County on August 15th, 1872, with everything he owned in one canvas sack, one axe, one bucksaw, one draw knife, $4 in coin, and 40 acres of land that no one else wanted. The land had been logged 3 years before. The Knapp Stout Company had taken every white pine worth taking, trees that had stood for 200 years, hauled out in a single winter. What remained looked like a battlefield. Stumps jutted from the ground every 10 feet, some as wide as a man's arm span. Brush tangled between them, thick with bramble and scrub maple. Somewhere beneath the chaos, the soil was supposed to be good. The railroad pamphlet had promised that. The pamphlet had promised many things. Arne walked his 40 acres that first afternoon, looking for what he needed. Cabin logs, straight timber, 12 to 20 feet long, thick enough to notch and stack. The kind of logs that every settler used, the kind that every cabin required. He found none. The loggers had taken everything straight. What they left behind was crooked, knotty, forked, and short. Poplar suckers no thicker than his wrist. Cedar scrub twisted by wind. Oak stumps that would take a week to grub out. There was wood everywhere on his 40 acres, more wood than he could burn in 10 winters, but not a single tree he could use to build a cabin. He had 8 weeks until the first hard freeze. Arne had not always been poor. 5 years earlier, he had stepped off the boat in Milwaukee with his wife Marta and $200 saved from 3 years of fishing off the Norwegian coast. They had plans, a farm, children, a life in this new country where land was cheap and a man could own what he worked. The lumber mill in Menomonee was hiring. Arne took the job, planned to work 2 years, save enough for land and equipment. He was strong. The work was brutal, 12-hour days feeding logs into the saw, but he did not complain. By 1871, he had nearly $200 in the Bank of Menomonee, enough to start. Then Marta caught typhoid. She died in July of 1872 in a boarding house that smelled of lye soap and fever. The doctor cost $18. The burial cost $12 more. Arne held her hand until it went cold, then walked back to the mill to work his shift. 2 months later, the panic hit. The Bank of Menomonee failed on September 3rd. Arne's remaining savings, $147, vanished overnight. The mill shut down the same week. No one was buying lumber when the whole country was collapsing. In the space of 60 days, Arne lost his wife, his money, and his work. What he had left, his tools, his body, and $12 he had kept in his boot rather than the bank. He bought 40 acres of cut-over land from the railroad for $12. It was the cheapest land in Wisconsin, and now he understood why. On August 20th, Arne walked 4 miles to the nearest established farm. He needed advice. He needed to understand what he was facing. Halvor Knutson's place was everything Arne's was not: a proper cabin, hewn logs, tight chinking, glass windows, a barn, a smokehouse, split-rail fences marking out fields already cleared of stumps. Knutson had been in Wisconsin since 1858. He had survived 11 winters. He had buried 2 brothers. Arne found him mending a harness in the dooryard and introduced himself, explained his situation, asked how a man built a cabin alone. Knutson listened. Then he laughed. Not cruel laughter, the weary laugh of a man watching someone walk toward a cliff. You have no logs, Knutson said. I have seen that land. The company took everything worth taking. What remains is fit for firewood, nothing else. There must be a way, Arna said. Men have built cabins with less. Men have died with more. Knutson set down the harness. His hands were thick with scar tissue, 2 fingers missing on the left, frostbite from the winter of '69, the same winter that killed his brothers. A cabin requires logs 12 feet long at minimum, straight as a rifle barrel, or the walls will not seat. I see nothing but stumps and brush on your 40 acres. Where will you find logs? I can buy them, have them hauled. With what money? Milled lumber costs $3 per 100 board feet. You would need $500 in materials to build what I built, and then you would need men. 20 men work 3 days to raise my walls. Walls must go up fast before the logs settle and bind. A man alone cannot lift a 12-foot log above his waist. Even if you had the timber, you could not raise it. Arna said nothing. The numbers were the numbers. Knutson studied him, saw the worn clothes, the hollow cheeks, the calloused hands. How much money do you have? $4. Another laugh, this one bitter. $4 will not buy glass for a single window. $4 will not buy nails for a door frame. A man cannot build a cabin for $4. Then what do I do? Knutson stood. He was a big man, broad across the shoulders, face weathered to leather by 15 years of Wisconsin wind. When he spoke, his voice held no malice, only certainty. You go back to Menominee. You find work in a mill, a shop, anywhere. You spend the winter earning money, and next spring you come back with enough to do this properly. Or, he paused, you dig a dugout, a hole in a hillside roofed with logs and sod. Men have survived winters in dugouts, not comfortably, not safely, but they have survived. And if I build a cabin anyway? Knutson's expression did not change. Then you will die out there. A man alone cannot raise walls before the freeze. You have 8 weeks. You have no logs, no help, and no money. The math does not lie. He picked up the harness again, thread and needle, conversation over. I knew a man like you, he said without looking up. Stubborn, proud. Arrived in '68 with nothing and would not listen to anyone. Built a shanty from brush and bark, said he would improve it come spring. They found his body in March. Wolves had been at it. Could not even bury him proper. The ground was still frozen. He looked up one last time. A man alone cannot raise walls before the freeze. You will die out there, and no one will find your body until spring. Arna walked back to his 40 acres in silence. 4 miles through cut-over land, stumps and brush, and the wreckage of what had once been forest. Knutson's words circled in his head like crows. No logs, no help, no money. 8 weeks. He had been a fool to come here, a fool to think that land alone was enough. Land without resources was just a place to starve. But where else could he go? Menominee was full of men looking for work that did not exist. Milwaukee was worse. He had no family in America, no one to take him in. His wife was dead. His savings were gone. This 40 acres of stumps and brush was all he had. He could dig a dugout. Knutson had said men survived in dugouts, a hole in a hillside, roofed with whatever he could drag over it. Dark, damp, close to the earth, like a grave you lived in until spring. Arna stopped walking. He was standing at the edge of his land where he had stacked firewood against a stump 2 days earlier. Short rounds of cedar, 12 to 16 inches long, split and piled to dry. Firewood. The one thing his land had in abundance. The stack was perhaps 4 feet high, 3 feet wide. He had covered it with bark slabs to keep off the rain. Now he looked at it differently. The rounds were stable. They had not shifted or tumbled despite rain and wind. The cut ends faced outward, and where rain had hit them, the water had beaded and run off rather than soaking in. The bark side of the wood, if he had stacked it that direction, would have absorbed the rain, but the cut ends shed it. He thought of his grandfather's stories. In Norway, in the mountains, poor farmers had built walls from chunks of wood stacked with clay between them. Kubeveggteknikken, his grandfather had called it. Chunk wall building. The old man had seen one such building as a child, said it had stood for 50 years. Arna pulled a round from the stack. It weighed perhaps 15 pounds. He could lift it easily with one hand. A 12-foot cabin log weighed 300 pounds or more. It required 4 men to carry, 20 men to raise into a wall. This round weighed 15 pounds. He could carry 100 of them in a day. He looked at his land again. The stumps, the brush, the crooked, knotty, twisted timber that no logger would touch, the cedar scrub, the poplar suckers, the short, worthless wood that covered every acre, worthless for cabin logs, but not worthless for this. His heart began to beat faster. He saw it now, not the land's poverty, but its possibility. He did not need 12-foot logs. He did not need 20 men. He did not need anything he could not do alone. He needed short rounds, mortar, a frame to hold it all together. The rounds he had. Thousands of them, everywhere he looked. Mortar required lime. Lime came from limestone, and 3 days earlier, walking his boundary line, he had seen limestone outcroppings along the creek. Gray stone jutting from the hillside, free for the taking. Burn limestone with wood, and you get quickite. Slake quickite with water, and you get lime. Mix lime with sand and sawdust, and you get mortar. He had seen masons do it. He had watched bricklayers in Menominee build walls that would outlast any log cabin. A wall of short rounds stacked like bricks, mortared in place. Cut ends facing out to shed rain. Mortar sealing every gap. No chinking to fail. No wind to penetrate. The rounds could be any length he chose. If he cut them 16 inches long, his walls would be 16 inches thick, 16 inches of wood and mortar. What would that hold? How much cold could 16 inches stop? He did not know. No one he had ever met had built such a thing, but he knew what the alternative was: dugout or death. Knutson had made that clear. This was a third option, uncertain, untested, possibly fatal. But his. Arna began cutting rounds on September 3rd. He worked from first light until he could no longer see 14 hours a day. Cedar when he could find it, the rot-resistant wood his grandfather had said was best. Poplar when cedar ran out. Even some oak, though he worried about the weight. Each round had to be debarked. Bark held moisture, attracted insects, rotted the wood from outside in. Arna stripped bark with his drawn knife until his shoulders screamed and his hands cracked and bled. By the end of the first week, he had 200 rounds stacked in rows to dry. By the end of the second week, 400. He needed perhaps 2,000 for a small cabin. 12 by 16 feet, 8-foot walls. Smaller than Knutson's place, but enough for one man. Enough to survive. The frame came next. 4 corner posts, sunk 3 feet in the ground, rising 8 feet above. Cedar, again, the straightest pieces he could find, though none were truly straight. Crossbeams at 5 feet and 8 feet, notched into the posts. A simple skeleton that would hold the roof and support the cordwood walls. Raising the beams alone was a problem Knutson had not considered. The solution came to Arnie on the fifth night, lying awake in his canvas tent, shoulder throbbing from the day's work. Block and tackle. Rope looped over a high branch, mechanical advantage multiplying his strength. He had seen the mill workers use such rigs to move logs no team could lift. It took him 2 days to rig the system. Another day to raise the first cross beam, working the rope inch by inch, bracing with wooden props as he went. When the beam finally seated in its notch, Arna sat on the ground and wept. Not from joy, from exhaustion, from the knowledge that he had 3 more beams to raise and a roof to build, and 2,000 rounds to stack, and winter was coming, and he was so tired that his hands shook when he tried to eat. Einar Dahl found him in early September, gathering limestone along the creek. Dahl was Norwegian, too. Arna had heard his name from Knutsen, another immigrant farmer 2 miles north. He was perhaps 40, lean and watchful, riding a sway-backed mare that picked her way carefully through the stumps. "You are the one building on the old cutover," Dahl said. It was not a question. Arna straightened from his work, limestone chunks piled in a canvas sling. "I am." "Knutsen says you have no logs. He says you're building with firewood." Dahl's face showed nothing, not mockery, not sympathy, just careful attention. "Cordwood," Arna said. "Short rounds with mortar between, like a mason builds a wall." "I have never seen a house made from firewood." "Neither have I, but I have seen walls made from brick, and this is the same principle. Stack mortar, stack mortar. The logs are short, but the wall is thick, 16 inches. Dahl dismounted. He was shorter than Arnie, but broader, farmer's muscles built from years of work. He studied the limestone in Arne's sling, then looked at the rounds drying in rows nearby. "Mortar cracks," he said. "I have seen it crack in church walls built by proper masons. The freeze comes, the water expands, the mortar fails. What happens when your mortar cracks in January?" It was the question Arna had asked himself every night since he started. He had an answer. He had to have an answer, but he did not know if it was true. "The mortar will be inside as well as outside. 2 beads with sawdust between. If the outer bead cracks, the inner bead holds. If both crack," he stopped. "Then I will die. But I will die anyway if I do nothing." Dahl considered this. He walked to the stacked rounds, picked one up, tested its weight, set it back down. "The mortar must cure before hard freeze," he said. "Lime mortar needs weeks to set properly. If you start too late, it will crumble before spring." "Then I must start soon." "You have not burned your lime yet." "No." "That takes 3 days, if nothing goes wrong." Dahl looked north, where the sky was pale and cold despite the midday sun. "The first frost comes in 4 weeks, perhaps 5. You are betting your life on weather that no man can predict." Arne said nothing. There was nothing to say. Dahl mounted his horse. Before he rode away, he looked back. "I hope you are right, but I think you will spend October digging your own grave." Arne burned his first batch of lime on September 10th. He built the kiln from stacked limestone, layers of rock alternating with layers of cordwood, the whole pile 4 feet high and 6 feet wide. He lit it at dawn and fed it for 48 hours straight, sleeping in snatches between loadings. The limestone cracked and popped as it heated. White smoke poured from the gaps between stones, not wood smoke, but something acrid, choking, that burned his throat and made his eyes stream. By the second night, the stones glowed red in the darkness, and the heat was so intense he could not approach within 10 feet. When the fire finally died, he let the kiln cool for another day. Then he broke it apart with a long pole, careful not to touch anything directly. What remained of the limestone was different now, chalite, calcium oxide, hungry for water. He crushed it with a wooden mallet, scooped it into a barrel, and carried it back to his building site. Slaking the lime was almost as dangerous as burning it. When water hit the chalite, the mixture boiled and hissed, releasing heat that could blister skin. Arna poured water slowly, stirring with a long stick, face turned away. The paste that formed was caustic, white as milk, smooth as butter. Mixed with sand and sawdust, it became mortar. His first lime burn yielded 1 barrel, enough, he estimated, for 1/4 of his walls. He would need to burn 3 more batches minimum. He had burned through nearly a quart of firewood in the process. Firewood he would need for winter. Everything was connected. Everything was a trade-off, and there was never enough of anything. September ended. The frame stood complete, 4 cedar posts rising against the sky, cross beams level, roof joist waiting for shakes. From a distance, it looked almost like a cabin, the skeleton of one, at least. Up close, you could see the gaps, the open walls, the bare earth floor. The first frost came on October 2nd, earlier than Arna had hoped, later than he had feared. He woke to find ice on the water bucket, white rime on the canvas of his tent. His breath plumed in the cold air. He had been stacking cordwood for 3 weeks. The first wall, the south wall, where the sun would help cure the mortar, rose 4 feet high. The technique was simple once you understood it. Lay a bead of mortar on the foundation log, set around, lay another bead on top. Fill the center with sawdust mixed with lime at 12-1. Repeat. The mortar squelched and spread. The round settled into place. The wall grew round by round like a living thing, 8 square feet per day. That was his rate, slower than he had hoped, faster than he had feared. At 8 square feet per day, he needed perhaps 40 days to complete all 4 walls. He had perhaps 30 days before hard freeze made mortar work impossible. The math said he would fail. The math had always said he would fail. But Arne kept building. The second wall went up faster. He was learning which rounds to choose, how much mortar to apply, when to let a course cure before adding the next. By October 15th, he had 2 walls complete, and the third was started. Then the rain came. 3 days of cold, driving rain that turned his building site to mud and seeped into everything. He could not work in rain. The mortar would not cure. The wood would not dry. The walls would fail before they were finished. He huddled in his tent, ate cold beans, and watched his deadline approach. On the 4th day, the rain stopped. But when Arno went to check his lime supply, his stomach dropped. The 3rd kiln had failed. He had built it before the rain, planning to fire it during a dry spell. But the rain had come instead, soaking the limestone, flooding the wood. The whole structure had collapsed into a muddy heap. 2 days of work, gone. 1/4 of his lime supply, gone. He stood in the ruins of the kiln, rain-soaked and exhausted, and felt something he had not felt since Marta died: despair. The walls would not be finished in time. He would run out of mortar before he ran out of wall. And then the freeze would come, and the half-built cabin would stand as a monument to his failure, and Knutsen would be right, and Dahl would be right, and Gustav Lindquist. Arnie straightened. He had met Lindquist only once, at the man's general store, where he had bought minimal provisions with his dwindling cash. Lindquist had heard about the Cordwood cabin. Lindquist had offered to buy Arnie's land. Lindquist had predicted, in front of 6 other men, that the woodpile house would collapse by Christmas. $8, Lindquist had offered. $8 for 40 acres that Arne had paid 12 for, because Lindquist knew. He knew that Arne would fail, and when he did, Lindquist would buy the land for back taxes, pennies on the dollar. The despair burned away, replaced by something hotter. Not hope. He did not have enough left for hope, but refusal. Simple, stubborn refusal to give Lindquist what he wanted. Arne rebuilt the kiln that afternoon. Smaller this time, using drier wood, covering the whole thing with bark slabs to shed any rain. He fired it at dusk and sat up all night feeding it, watching the glow through the gaps in the bark. By dawn, he had lime. Not enough, but some. Einar Dahl returned in mid-October. Arne heard the hoofbeats and emerged from the half-built cabin, mortar on his hands, sawdust in his hair. Dahl sat on his mare, staring. The walls had risen since his last visit, two complete, a third halfway up, the fourth just started. The structure looked strange, unlike any building Dahl had ever seen. The round ends of the logs protruded slightly from the mortar, creating a textured surface like nothing else. In the afternoon light, it almost seemed to glow. "You are still alive," Dahl said. "I did not expect that." "Not yet dead." Dahl dismounted. He walked to the nearest wall, the completed south wall, and pressed his palm against it. His eyebrows rose. "It is warm. The wall is warm." "The sun heats it during the day. The thickness holds the heat." Dahl pushed against the wall. It did not move. He pushed harder, the push of a man testing a fence post, a man who knew what solid felt like. The wall was solid. "I have never seen anything like this," he said quietly. "Neither have I." Dahl walked around the structure, examining joints, testing mortar, studying how the rounds fit together. Arne watched him and said nothing. There was nothing to say. The walls spoke for themselves, or they did not. Finally, Dahl returned to where Arne stood. He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a cloth sack, heavy, lumpy. "Potatoes," he said. 20 pounds, and salt pork, 10 pounds. My wife says no man should die alone. You will repay in spring." Arne's throat tightened. He had not eaten well in weeks. His belt was cinched 3 notches tighter than when he arrived. The smell of salt pork, even through the cloth, made his mouth water. "Why?" Dahl shrugged. "You are still alive. That means something?" He mounted his horse, then paused. "Lindquist is telling everyone your cabin will collapse by December. He has bet money on it." "Let him." "He may be right. You still have 2 walls to finish, and the freeze is coming." "I know." Dahl nodded. He looked at the walls once more, the strange, textured walls that should not exist, built by a man who should already be dead. "I told you that you were digging your grave," he said. "I hope I was wrong." He rode away. Arne stood in the doorway of his half-built cabin, holding 20 pounds of potatoes like a man holding a miracle. November came. The third wall went up round by round, mortar bed by mortar bed. Arne worked even in the cold now, his breath clouding as he laid each piece. The mortar took longer to cure, twice as long as September, then 3 times as long. But it cured. The walls held. His lime ran out on November 4th. He had 1 wall remaining, the north wall, the cold wall, the one that would take the worst punishment from winter wind. He had no time to burn more lime. The ground was freezing. Soon it would be too hard to dig limestone from the hillside. The temperatures at night were dropping below 20 degrees. Arne mixed his remaining lime with extra sand, stretching it as far as it would go. The mortar was weaker this way. He knew it, could feel it in the way it spread. But weaker mortar was better than no mortar. He worked 18 hours a day, resting only when his hands shook too badly to hold a round. On November 10th, he laid the last round on the last course of the north wall. The cabin was closed. but closed was not finished. He had 4 walls and a roof, but he had no door, no windows, no stove. The openings gaped in the walls where door and windows should be, 2 feet by 3 feet, covered temporarily with canvas that flapped in every breeze. The door he built from cedar planks, hewn with his axe, joined with wooden pegs because he could not afford nails, leather hinges cut from his own belt, a rope latch that could be pulled from either side. The windows he could not afford to glaze. Glass cost money, and his money was gone, down to 73 cents spent on nails for the roof. Instead, he stretched oiled paper over the frames, paper soaked in lard, translucent but not transparent. It let in light but not sight. The stove was the hardest. A cabin without a stove was not a cabin. It was a coffin with walls. The cheapest cast iron stove cost $10, and Arne had less than one. He found it on November 12th at Lindquist's store. A departing settler, heading back east to family who would take him in, selling everything he could not carry. A small box stove rusted at the joints, cracked along one seam. $3, the man said. Arne had 73 cents. I can give you 2 days' labor, he said. Come spring. Anything you need clearing, fencing, hauling. The man looked at Arne, at his hollow cheeks, his cracked hands, his clothes that hung off his frame. The man saw a dead man walking and knew it. $3 or nothing. Lindquist was watching from behind the counter. Arne could feel his eyes, could feel the satisfaction radiating from him. Here it was, the moment of failure. A cabin without a stove was worthless. Arne would freeze, and Lindquist would buy his land for taxes, and everything would proceed as the math had always said it would. I will take the labor. Arne turned. The voice came from behind him, Einar Dahl, standing in the store doorway, a sack of flour over his shoulder. 3 days' labor, Dahl said to the departing settler. This man's labor comes spring. I will guarantee it. You will guarantee it? I will. If he dies, I will work the days myself. The settler shrugged. Dead man's labor or living man's guarantee, either way, he was leaving. Done. Arne carried the stove home that afternoon, 3 miles through frozen mud, the cast iron digging into his shoulders with every step. Behind him he could hear Lindquist's voice, still loud enough to carry. That stove will not save him. That woodpile will not hold. He will be dead by January, and Dahl will be working off a fool's debt. On November 15th, Arne lit his stove for the first time. The chimney drew well, stacked stone mortared with the last of his lime, rising through a hole in the roof. Smoke poured out the top, and the cabin filled with warmth. Arne stood in the center of his 12 by 16-foot cabin, his cordwood cabin, his woodpile house, his impossible accomplishment, and felt the heat seep into his bones. The walls were warm to the touch from inside, cool from outside. The mortar had sealed every gap. No draft penetrated anywhere. The 16 inches of wood and mortar stood between him and the winter that had killed better men in better shelters. Outside, the temperature was 22 degrees. Inside, his thermometer, a gift from Dahl's wife, delivered with the potatoes, read 51 degrees. 29 degrees of difference. The walls were holding, but November was not the test. November was warm compared to what was coming. Knutsen's brothers had died in January. The killing cold came in January, when temperatures dropped to 30 below and stayed there for weeks. The walls were holding now. Would they hold then? Arne fed his stove twice that first day. Just twice. In a log cabin, he knew, men fed their stoves every 3 hours when the temperature dropped below freezing. The chinking failed, the gaps widened, the wind found every crack. His walls had no chinking. His walls had mortar, continuous and sealed. His walls were 16 inches thick. Would they hold? He did not know. No one knew. This had never been done. Not here. Not like this. Not by a man alone with $4 and a pile of firewood. December came. The temperature dropped to 0. Arne fed his stove twice a day, and his cabin held 48 degrees. He cut firewood when weather permitted, building his supply for the worst months ahead. 3.5 cords stacked against the north wall. 6 cords was safe, 8 cords was comfortable. He had half of what he needed, but half was more than nothing, and the walls were holding. Outside, the snow piled higher. The stumps disappeared beneath white drifts. The world contracted to the space between cabin and woodpile, woodpile and outhouse, outhouse and cabin. Arne saw no one for 3 weeks. Dahl did not visit. Knutson did not visit. Lindquist, presumably, was waiting for news of a frozen corpse. Christmas came and went. The woodpile house did not collapse. On January 6, 1873, Arne woke to strange warmth. The temperature outside had risen overnight, 35 degrees, practically balmy. The snow on his roof began to drip. Water ran in rivulets down his walls, pooling at the foundation. He went outside to cut wood, grateful for the mild weather. His firewood supply had dwindled to 3 cords. Another week of hard cold, and he would be in trouble. The sky was clear. The sun was bright. The warmth felt like a gift. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, Arne looked up from his chopping and saw the horizon disappear. The wall of white came from the northwest, moving faster than any storm Arne had ever seen. One moment the sky was clear, the sun bright on melting snow. The next, the tree line vanished, swallowed whole, as if God had drawn a curtain across the world. Then the stumps disappeared. Then the woodpile, 30 feet away. Then his own hands raised before his face. He dropped his axe and ran. The wind hit him before he reached the door, not a gust, but a force, a physical thing with weight and malice. It shoved him sideways, tore at his coat, drove ice crystals into every gap in his clothing. The temperature was already plummeting. He could feel it on his exposed skin, the balmy morning replaced by something that burned with cold. Snow drove horizontally, filling his eyes, his nose, his mouth when he gasped for breath. He could not see the cabin. He could not see anything. The world had become white, not the gentle white of snowfall, but the screaming white of annihilation, of everything familiar erased. 10 steps to the cabin, maybe 12. He had walked this path 1,000 times in 4 months. He knew exactly where the door was. He ran anyway, one arm raised against the wind, the other groping ahead like a blind man. His boot caught on something, a stump buried under yesterday's snow, invisible now beneath the new fall, and he pitched forward. His left arm struck the woodpile first. The logs were stacked waist high, split cedar and oak, edges sharp as chisels. His forearm hit edge on, and the pain was immediate, enormous, a white flash that matched the white world around him. He felt the flesh part, felt the warmth of blood against the cold of wind. He scrambled up, blood on the snow, bright red against white, already vanishing under fresh accumulation. His arm screamed when he moved it. Something was very wrong, torn muscle, maybe tendon, maybe worse, but he could not stop, could not think. The cabin was somewhere ahead, and outside the cabin was death. 3 more steps. 4. 5. His outstretched right hand struck wood, the doorframe, solid cedar, exactly where it should be. He found the rope latch by feel, yanked it with numb fingers, and fell inside as the wind tried to tear the door from his grip. The door slammed. The rope latch caught. The howling muted to a roar, still deafening but no longer inside his skull. Arne lay on the dirt floor of his cabin, bleeding, gasping, snow melting into mud beneath him. Outside, the world had ended. Inside, the stove still held embers from the morning fire, glowing orange in the sudden darkness. He was alive, he was sheltered, and the real test had just begun. The gash ran from elbow to wrist, a diagonal slash across the meat of his forearm, deep enough to show pale tissue beneath the welling blood, deep enough that he could see the wound flecks when he moved his fingers. He could move his fingers. That meant the tendons were intact, or mostly intact. He could bend his elbow, though it cost him a groan he could not suppress. The bone was probably whole. Probably. But the blood was coming fast, soaking through his wool sleeve, dripping onto the floor in a steady patter. Every heartbeat pushed more out. He did not have time to be careful. Arna tore a strip from his spare shirt with his teeth in one working hand, wrapped it around the wound, pulling tight, tighter, until the pressure made white spots dance in his vision. The bleeding slowed, soaked through the cloth, but did not drip. It would have to be enough. His ribs announced themselves when he tried to sit up. Left side low, where he had hit the woodpile after his arm. Not the grinding agony of a break. He had felt broken ribs before, in the mill, when a log kicked loose, but something close. Cracked, maybe. Badly bruised at minimum. Breathing hurt. Moving hurt. Everything hurt. The stove. The stove needed wood. He crawled to it, dragging his left arm, and fed the embers with kindling. His right hand trembled as he worked. Shock, cold, pain, all three. And he dropped the first stick twice before it caught. Then larger pieces, building the fire back to something that could hold against what was coming. The cabin temperature had dropped while he was outside. His thermometer, Dahl's wife's gift, the one kindness he had received in months, read 38 degrees. Cold, but not killing cold. The walls were doing their work, holding what heat remained. But heat needed fuel, and fuel needed fire. Arne pulled himself upright, leaning against the wall, and took stock. Firewood inside the cabin, 1/4 cord perhaps. The stack against the interior wall, 20 logs, maybe 25, cut to stove length and ready to burn. At his normal burn rate, 2 days' worth. At survival burn rate, minimum fire to prevent freezing, perhaps 4 days. Firewood outside, 3 cords, stacked against the north wall of the cabin. Distance from door to woodpile, 30 feet. Visibility outside, 0. Temperature outside, dropping by the minute. He pressed his palm against the north wall, the wall that faced the worst of the wind. He could feel the storm against it, a constant pressure, like a giant leaning on his house. The mortar joints flexed. The round shifted by fractions of an inch, but they held. The 16 inches of wood and mortar stood between him and annihilation. His arm throbbed. His ribs ached. His face burned where frostbite was already setting in, ears, nose, cheeks, all the places the wind had touched. But he was inside, and inside was survivable. For now. The first night was the longest of his life. He had lived through hard nights before. The night Marta died, holding her hand as the fever took her. The night the bank failed, walking the streets of Menominee while his future collapsed. The night he arrived on this land and understood what he had bought, 40 acres of stumps and brush and nothing. This was worse. The temperature outside dropped past 0 as darkness fell, past 10 below by midnight, past 20 below by the small hours when even the wolves stopped howling because the cold had driven them to shelter. The wind never stopped, 70 miles per hour, gusting higher, a constant assault that made the cabin creak and groan like a ship in a gale. Snow piled against the north wall. He could not see it, but he could feel it, the growing weight pressing against the logs and mortar. Each hour added more. Each hour tested his walls. The cabin held. At 25 below, with wind that could freeze exposed skin in 3 minutes, his interior temperature read 39 degrees. Cold enough to see his breath hanging in the air, cold enough to keep him from anything resembling sleep. But above freezing, above the point where water turned to ice, where blood slowed, where a man's heart simply stopped, his walls were holding, but walls could not save him if the fire died. Arne fed the stove every 2 hours. Not by the clock, he had no clock, but by the rhythm of the fire itself. When the flames died to embers, when the heat faded enough that he could feel the cold creeping back, he added wood. 1 log, sometimes 2. Never 3. 3 was waste. 3 was burning through his supply faster than he could afford. His left arm was useless for this work. The wound had clotted, the bleeding stopped, but the flesh was swollen and hot to the touch, early infection setting in despite the cold. He could not grip with that hand, could not lift with that arm. Everything had to happen with his right hand alone, bracing logs against his body, maneuvering them into the stove by leverage and stubbornness. The cracked rib made every movement an exercise in controlled agony. Bending to pick up a log sent pain shooting through his left side. Straightening drove it deeper. Breathing, just breathing, felt like someone pressing a blade between his bones. By midnight, he had used half his inside wood. 12 logs remained. 12 logs between him and darkness. By dawn, gray light filtering through oiled paper windows, barely distinguishable from night. He had used 3/4. 8 logs remained. Outside, the wind still howled. The snow still drove. The temperature had dropped to 32 below. At his current rate, he would burn through the last log by midday. And then the fire would die. And then he would die. The morning brought a choice he had hoped never to face. He could stay inside, feed his remaining logs to the stove, one by one, stretching them as far as they could go. Hope the storm ended before the fire did. Pray that the wind died, that the snow stopped, that the world returned to something survivable. If the storm lasted another day, if it lasted 2 days, 3 days, he would freeze in his cabin, surrounded by 3 cords of firewood he could not reach, 100 feet of fuel, and none of it would matter because he could not cross 30 feet of frozen hell to get it. Or he could go outside, 30 feet to the woodpile, in zero visibility, in 70-mile-per-hour winds that would strip heat from his body faster than any fire could replace it, in temperatures that had dropped to 34 below zero, cold enough to freeze spit before it hit the ground, cold enough to kill a man in minutes, with one working arm, with ribs that screamed every time he moved. Arne sat by his stove, cradling his wounded arm, and considered the mathematics of survival. Stay inside, certain death if the storm continued past midday. Go outside, probable death, but possible survival if he reached the woodpile and returned. It was not a difficult choice. It was not even a choice at all. It was mathematics, cold and clear, and mathematics did not care how much it hurt. He had rope. 1 coil, 50 feet, purchased months ago for raising his roof beams. He tied one end to the door frame with a knot that would not slip, then knotted the rope at arm's length intervals, markers he could count by touch, a lifeline he could follow back if he lost his way. The woodpile was north of the door, directly north against the cabin's north wall, 30 feet, maybe 35. If he kept the wind at his back, if the wind stayed from the northwest, as it had all night, he would find it. If the wind shifted, if he lost his grip on the rope, if he fell and could not rise. He did not think about those things. Thinking would stop him, and stopping would kill him. He wrapped his face in every scrap of cloth he could find, the wool scarf Marta had knitted 3 winters ago before the typhoid took her. linen strips torn from his spare shirt, a piece of canvas that still smelled of sawdust and lime from the mortar mixing. Layer after layer, until only his eyes remained exposed. Even those he shielded with his right hand, cupped above his brow like a man blocking the sun. He checked the rope one more time, fed the stove one more log, 7 remaining now. Looked around the cabin he had built with his own hands, the walls that should not exist, the shelter that everyone said would collapse. Then he opened the door. Dry. The wind hit him like a fist. It drove him backward, nearly off his feet, ripping the door from his grip. Snow poured into the cabin, a white flood swirling past him, settling on the dirt floor. The fire in the stove guttered, nearly died, and for one terrible moment Arna thought he had killed himself by opening the door. But the fire held. The coals were deep enough, the draft strong enough, and the flames stuttered back to life as Arnie grabbed the rope and plunged into the white. 3 steps. He could see nothing. Absolutely nothing. The snow was not falling. It was flying, horizontal, a river of ice that scoured every inch of exposed skin. The cold was so intense it felt like burning, like someone had set fire to his face and ears and hands. His lungs seized on the first breath. The air was too cold to breathe, cold enough to freeze the moisture in his throat. He coughed, gasped, forced himself to breathe shallowly through the layers of cloth over his mouth. 5 steps. The rope slid through his right hand, knot by knot, each one a marker of distance. His left arm hung at his side, useless, the wound throbbing with every heartbeat. 8 steps. His eyes were streaming, tears freezing on his cheeks. He could not wipe them away, could not release the rope for even a second. The wind was pushing him, shoving him off course, and only the rope kept him oriented. 12 steps. Was he going the right direction? He could not tell. The wind should be at his back, pushing him north toward the woodpile, but the gusts came from everywhere, swirling, shifting, and he could no longer say which way was which. 15 steps. The rope was his only truth. The rope was all that mattered. Follow the rope. Count the knots. Do not let go. 18 steps. His right hand struck something solid. Wood. Stacked wood, buried under snow, but unmistakably the woodpile. He had found it. Snow had covered half the stack, a drift 6 feet high against the north wall, packed hard by the wind. But the upper logs were exposed, crusted with ice, but not buried. He could reach them. Arna grabbed a log with his right hand. The cold had stiffened his fingers, slowed his reactions, but he forced them to close. Tucked the log under his arm, pressing it against his body. Reached for another. His fingers would not cooperate. They were clumsy, slow, like someone else's fingers attached to his hand. Frostbite. The beginning of frostbite. In another 10 minutes, they would not work at all. He grabbed a second log, a third, wedged them against his chest with his useless left arm, ignoring the scream of his ribs. 4 logs. 5. As many as he could carry one-handed, which was not enough, which would never be enough, but which was all he could manage. He turned and followed the rope back. The return was longer than the outbound trip. It always was, fighting the wind instead of riding it. Each step cost more effort than the last. The wind shoved against his chest, tried to tear the logs from his grip, tried to push him sideways off the rope's path. He counted knots, 18, 15, 12. Each one a small victory, a few more feet towards safety. At 10 knots he stumbled. His boot caught on something, the same stump that had tripped him before, or another just like it, and he went down. The logs scattered, tumbling into the snow, vanishing in the white. He could not see them, could not see anything. He was on his hands and knees in the snow, the rope still clutched in his right hand, and his firewood was gone. For a moment, just a moment, he considered staying down, lying in the snow, letting the cold take him, ending the pain in his arm and his ribs and his frozen face. It would be easy. It would be so easy. Then he thought of Lindquist. Lindquist smirking behind his counter. Lindquist offering $8 for 40 acres. Lindquist telling everyone the woodpile house would collapse by Christmas. Arne was not going to die and prove Lindquist right. He felt for the logs by touch, sweeping his arm through the snow, fingers screaming with cold. Found one, found another, gathered them against his chest, awkward and painful, and forced himself upright. 7 knots, 5, 3. The door appeared from the white like a vision, dark rectangle in the howling void. His cabin, his shelter, still standing. He fell through it, dumping the logs on the floor, kicking the door shut behind him. The silence was shocking. Not true silence. The wind still roared, the walls still creaked, but silence compared to outside. Inside sound, survivable sound. Arne lay on the floor, gasping, snow melting beneath him. His ears burned, his nose burned, his cheeks burned. His fingers were white, waxy, numb, frostbite, for certain, though not yet severe. But he had wood. 4 logs plus his remaining 7 made 11. Another day. Maybe 2, if he was careful. He fed the stove and did not move for hours. The second night was easier than the first, not because the storm had weakened, it had not, but because Arne had crossed a threshold. He had gone outside and returned. He had faced the worst the blizzard could offer and survived. The fear was still there, cold and heavy in his chest, but it no longer controlled him. He fed the stove carefully, stretching his wood as far as it would go. 3 logs through the night, each one a calculated gamble, enough to keep the temperature above freezing, not so much that he burned through his supply. The cabin held steady at 36 degrees. Outside, the thermometer read, had he been able to check it, somewhere between 35 and 40 below. Nearly 80 degrees of difference. His 16-inch walls, his mortar joints, his sawdust insulation were doing exactly what he had designed them to do. His arm throbbed through the night. The wound was infected now. He could feel the heat radiating from it, could see the red streaks spreading up toward his elbow. Bad, but not yet deadly. Not yet sepsis. He washed it with hot water and salt, gritting his teeth against the pain, and wrapped it with fresh cloth. His ribs ached every time he breathed. He had learned to breathe shallowly, to move slowly, to avoid the sharp pain that came with sudden motion. Dawn came gray and howling. The storm continued. Arne made 2 more trips to the woodpile that day. The first trip nearly killed him. The wind had shifted overnight, coming now from due north, and he walked directly into its teeth. The rope saved him, kept him oriented when his senses failed, and he returned with 6 logs, shaking so hard he could barely close the door. The second trip was better. The wind died briefly in the afternoon, not stopping, but dropping from 70 miles per hour to perhaps 40. He moved fast, ignoring the pain in his arm and ribs, and brought back 8 logs. By nightfall, he had a full cord of wood inside the cabin. A week's worth. 2 weeks, if he was careful. He slept that night, real sleep, not the shallow dozing of the first night. His body demanded it, and he no longer had the strength to refuse. On the 3rd day, the wind died. It happened so gradually that Arne did not notice at first. The roar faded to a howl, the howl to a moan, the moan to a whisper. The constant pressure against the north wall eased. The cabin stopped creaking. By noon, the snow was falling straight down, vertical, gentle, almost peaceful. The horizontal assault had ended. The blizzard was over. Arne opened his door. The world outside was unrecognizable. Snow lay chest high against the north side of his cabin, sloping down to knee-deep at the south. His woodpile was a white mound, shapeless, with only the uppermost logs visible. The stumps that dotted his 40 acres had vanished entirely, swallowed by drifts that sculpted the landscape into something alien and strange. The temperature was 28 below zero. Not safe, not even close to safe, but survivable. The lethal cold was passing. Arne spent the afternoon digging. He cleared a path to the woodpile first, working one-handed with a cedar plank as a shovel. The snow was packed hard, heavy with wind-driven ice, and every shovelful sent pain shooting through his ribs. But he dug. 2 hours, 3 hours, until he could reach the stacked logs beneath the white. He hauled wood inside until his legs gave out, load after load, armful after armful, until a full cord was piled against his interior wall. More wood than he could burn in a month, enough to survive anything the winter could still throw at him. Then he closed the door, fed the stove, wrapped himself in every blanket he owned, and slept for 14 hours. He woke to silence and sunlight. True silence, no wind, no creaking, no howling. The storm had passed completely. Through his oiled paper windows, he could see golden light flooding the world outside, the sun rising into a sky of impossible blue. Arne opened the door and stepped into a world transformed. The snow glittered like diamonds, blinding white under the morning sun. The air was still, cold but not cutting, and he could breathe without pain for the first time in 3 days. The temperature read 23 below, but without wind, it felt almost warm. He looked at his cabin. The cordwood walls stood solid, unchanged, undamaged. Snow had piled against the north side nearly to the eaves, 6 feet of accumulated drift, but the structure had not budged. The mortar showed no cracks. The round showed no gaps. His 16-inch walls had done exactly what he built them to do. His arms still throbbed. The infection was receding. The red streaks had stopped spreading. The heat had diminished, but the wound would take weeks to heal properly. His frostbitten ears had blistered, peeling skin revealing raw tissue beneath. His cheeks were scabbed where the wind had flayed them. But he was alive. The cabin had held, and somewhere in the back of his mind, Arne heard Knutsen's voice. A man alone cannot raise walls before the freeze. You will die out there, and no one will find your body until spring. He had not died, and spring, when it came, would find him here, standing in front of the woodpile house that everyone said would collapse, warming his hands by a fire that never went out. He did not know yet how many had died. The news came slowly, filtering through the county as roads opened and neighbors emerged from shelter. The blizzard had swept across the upper Midwest, from Dakota Territory to Wisconsin, leaving frozen bodies in its wake. 3 miles to the east, Sten Halvorsen was dead. They found him in February, buried under snow that had collapsed his soddy roof. He had survived the first wave of the storm, the initial assault that drove Arne inside, but when the wind died briefly on the second day, Halvorsen had made a fatal mistake. He thought the worst was over. He set out to reach a neighbor, to share shelter, to find safety in numbers. The second wave caught him 100 yards from his own door. He died facing home. The snow buried him standing upright, and when they dug him out, his arms were still reaching toward a shelter he would never reach. He had been 31 years old, unmarried, alone on his 40 acres, just like Arne. But Halvorsen's soddy had not held. The walls were too thin. The roof was too weak. The shelter he trusted had failed him, and when it failed, he had nowhere to go. At Knutsen's farm, 4 miles west, the family had survived, but only barely. Knutsen's log cabin, built with 20 men in 3 days, had betrayed them. The chinking had cracked during December's freeze-thaw cycle, gaps opening between the logs where the daub had shrunk and fallen away. During the blizzard, wind penetrated everywhere, through the gaps, around the door frame, down the chimney when gusts shifted direction. They fed their stove every 90 minutes for 3 days straight. Knutson and his wife and his adult son worked in shifts, sleeping in snatches, one person always awake to feed the fire. When the storm passed, they had burned 4 cords of firewood, 4 cords, nearly their entire winter supply, in a single week. Knutson's wife had frostbite on both feet. She had been sleeping nearest the north wall when the worst of the cold penetrated, and by the time they moved her to the warmer side, the damage was done. She would walk again, but never without pain. His son had frostbite on his hands, minor, treatable, but a reminder of how close they had come. 4 cords. Arne had burned one. 1 cord to survive the same storm that had cost Knutson 4. At the Lindquist farm, the large frame house had held better. Multiple stoves, multiple rooms, hired hands to feed the fires around the clock. But 3 cows froze in the barn, and a hired man nearly died crossing 50 feet from house to livestock. They found him on the 4th day, huddled against the barn door, delirious with cold. He had been trying to pull the door open for 6 hours, but the snow had drifted against it, and his frozen hands could not manage the latch. He survived. Others did not. Over 70 people died in Minnesota that week. The count in Wisconsin was never fully recorded. Too many isolated homesteaders, too many bachelors on cutover land, too many bodies not discovered until the spring thaw. But everyone who survived understood. The blizzard of January 1873 was the worst in living memory, and the woodpile house had not collapsed. Halvor Knutson came on the last day of January. Arne heard him before he saw him, the rhythmic crunch of snowshoes breaking through the crusted surface, a steady sound that meant human, that meant visitor, that meant he was no longer alone. He opened the door and watched Knutson approach from the west. The big man moved slowly, carefully, picking his path through drifts that still reached chest-high in places. His breath plumed in the 15 below cold, and his face was wrapped in wool against the chill. Knutson stopped 10 feet from the cabin. For a long moment, he simply stood there, staring. His eyes moved over the walls, the cordwood walls, the mortared rounds with their ends protruding slightly, creating a textured surface unlike any building in the county. He looked at the snow piled against the north side, nearly to the eaves. He looked at the chimney, trickling smoke. He looked at the door and the man standing in it. "I came to see if you were dead," Knutson said. "I am not dead." Knutson walked closer. He circled the cabin slowly, studying it from every angle. When he reached the north wall, the wall that had taken the blizzard's worst punishment, he stopped, removed his mittens, pressed his bare palm against the mortared surface. His eyebrows rose. "It is warm," he said. "The wall is warm. From the inside, the wood holds the heat." Knutson pushed against the wall. Not a polite test, a hard shove, the kind of force that would reveal weakness. The wall did not move, did not flex, did not groan or shift or show any sign of strain. He walked the full perimeter, examining joints, testing mortar, studying how the rounds fit together. Arne watched from the doorway and said nothing. There was nothing to say. The walls spoke for themselves. When Knutson came back to the front, his face held something Arne had never seen there before. Not respect exactly. More like the expression of a man whose world had shifted, whose certainties had crumbled, who was seeing something he did not believe was possible. "How much wood did you burn?" Knutson asked. "During the storm." "1 cord, perhaps a little more." 1 cord. The words came flat, empty of the emotion that should have accompanied them. We burned 4 cords in 1 week. My wife's feet may never be right again. Silence stretched between them. The sun was bright on the snow, blindingly white. Somewhere in the distance, a crow called, the first bird sound Arna had heard in days. I told you that you would die, Knutson said finally. I told you a man alone cannot raise walls before the freeze. I told you no one would find your body until spring. You did. Knutson looked at the cabin again. The walls that should not exist, the shelter that should have failed, the proof standing before him in mortared wood that everything he knew about building was incomplete. I was wrong. The words hung in the frozen air. Knutson, who had survived 11 Wisconsin winters, who had buried 2 brothers to the cold, who had built his own cabin with 20 men in 3 days, admitting error to a man he had dismissed as a fool. Arna felt something loosen in his chest. Not pride, he was too exhausted for pride, but something, vindication maybe, or just relief. How did you build this? Knutson asked. Tell me how. I have sons who need land, and the good timber is gone. If a man can build walls from the wood that remains, from the crooked pieces and the short pieces and the timber no sawmill would touch. He trailed off, shaking his head. Tell me how. Arne stepped back from the doorway. Come inside. I'll show you everything. The warmth hit Knutson like a blow. He stopped just inside the door, swaying slightly, as if the temperature difference had physically unbalanced him. His eyes went wide. He looked at the small stove, the rusted box stove Dahl had vouched for, cracked along one seam, and then at the thermometer on the wall. What does it read? Arne checked. 44 degrees. 44. Knutson pulled off his hat, ran a hand through his thinning hair. It is 15 below outside. You have a 30-degree difference with... He looked at the stove again, as if expecting it to have transformed into something larger. With that? The walls hold the heat. They are 16 inches thick. The mortar seals every gap, the sawdust in the middle. Arne tapped the wall. The sawdust insulates like a feather tick. Heat stays in. Cold stays out. Knutson walked to the nearest wall and examined it the way a man examines a piece of machinery he does not understand. He saw the construction now, laid bare, the rounds stacked like bricks, the mortar beds on inner and outer faces, the gap between filled with something pale and fibrous. Sawdust, he said, touching the exposed edge of the fill. Sawdust, and what else? Lime. 12 parts sawdust to 1 part lime. The lime keeps insects out, keeps rot out. The sawdust holds dead air, and dead air is what stops cold. Why 2 mortar beds? Why not fill the whole thickness? Solid mortar would conduct cold. Stone conducts. Brick conducts. Anything solid carries heat from warm side to cold side. The sawdust breaks that path, 2 barriers with dead air between them. Knutson nodded slowly. He was a practical man, a man who had survived by understanding how things worked. He could see the logic now, the double mortar beds like 2 walls instead of 1, the sawdust like the space between 2 panes of glass, everything working together to trap warmth inside. The wood, he said, end grain facing out. I have never seen that. End grain sheds water. Side grain soaks it up. If I had laid the rounds lengthwise, they would have rotted through by now. End grain dries fast, even in rain, even in snow. The water beads and runs off instead of soaking in. And the mortar does not crack, even in this cold? It flexes. Look closely, Arne pointed to a joint near the window. You can see the gap widen slightly when the temperature drops. The wood shrinks, the mortar moves with it. but there are no holes. No wind gets through. Knutson crouched to examine the joint Arne had indicated. His fingers traced the line where mortar met wood, searching for gaps, searching for failure. He found none. "I have lived in Wisconsin for 15 years," he said quietly. "I have seen log cabins that stood for 30 years. I have seen frame houses that cost $500. I have never seen anything like this." "Neither have I. I built it because I had no choice. I had no logs, no help, no money. I had $4 and an axe and land covered with wood that no one else wanted." Knutson stood. He looked at Arne, really looked, perhaps for the first time. Saw the hollow cheeks, the healing frostbite, the arm wrapped in bandages. Saw the man who had done what Knutson said could not be done. "My sons will come in spring," Knutson said. "I will send them to you. Teach them what you taught yourself. Send them. I will teach anyone who asks." Einar Dahl arrived in early February, with his son Eric trudging behind him through the snow. The boy was 16, tall for his age, but still gangly, not yet grown into his adult frame. He stared at the Cordwood cabin the way a young man stares at something that has changed his understanding of the world, with awe and with hunger. "I want to learn," Eric said before his father could speak. "I want to build like this." Arne looked at Dahl, who shrugged. "The boy has talked of nothing else since we heard you survived. He wants land of his own. He wants to build." "The land here is cheap," Arne said. "Cut-over land like mine. No good timber, but plenty of wood for cordwood walls." "I know. I have been thinking about it." Dahl looked at the cabin, at the walls that had held through the worst blizzard in memory. "You said I could repay the debt, the potatoes, the stove, in spring. I do not want to pay in labor." "What do you want?" "Teach my son. Teach him everything, the mortar, the stacking, the lime burning, all of it. Let him build a cabin on the land next to yours where I can watch over him until he is established. That is what I want." Arne considered. He had built alone because he had no choice, but building alone was slow and painful and nearly killed him twice. Having help, having someone to teach, might make the next cabin easier. "Send him tomorrow," Arne said. "We will start with the mortar." Eric's face split into a grin so wide it must have hurt. Dahl's expression was harder to read, relief maybe, or something like wonder. "I told you that you were digging your grave," Dahl said. "Back in September, when you were burning lime, and I thought you were mad. I said you would die in October." "You did. I was wrong." Dahl extended his hand, not the brief grip of a transaction, but something firmer, something that meant more. "I will build too, when Eric's cabin is done, and we will tell everyone who asks that Arne Sletback taught us." Arne took the hand. His wounded arm twinged at the motion, but he did not let go. Eric learned quickly. He had his father's practical mind and his mother's patience, a combination that served him well in the slow, methodical work of cordwood construction. Within a week, he could mix mortar to the proper consistency. Within 2 weeks, he could lay a course of rounds as well as Arne. By the end of March, when the snow began to melt and the ground began to thaw, he was ready to start his own cabin. They built it together, Arne and Eric, teacher and student, on 40 acres adjacent to Arne's land. Cut-over country, stump-choked and brushy, but rich with the short, crooked timber that cordwood construction required. Eric's father provided lumber for the roof frame. Arne provided knowledge. The cabin went up faster than Arne's had. 2 workers instead of 1. No desperate race against winter. Time to do things properly, to let mortar cure fully, to debark logs carefully instead of rushing. By June, Eric Dahl had a home, 16 by 20 feet, 16-inch walls, 2 windows with real glass that his father had purchased in Green Bay. It was modest by any standard except the one that mattered. It would hold heat through a Wisconsin winter. It would not leak. It would not fail. Einar Dahl started his own cordwood cabin that summer, and 3 other families, settlers from the cut-over lands to the north, came to Arne asking questions. He taught them all. He showed them how to select wood, how to debark it, how to stack it for drying. He showed them how to burn lime, how to slake it, how to mix it with sand and sawdust. He showed them the two-bead technique, the sawdust fill, the way end grain sheds water. He answered questions until his voice went hoarse, and then he answered more. "Whoa, why do you not charge?" one of the settlers asked, a Finnish man named Makinen, who had lost everything in the panic and was starting over with less than Arne had started with. "You could make money from this. People would pay." Arne thought about it, thought about Marta, buried in a pauper's grave because he could not afford better, thought about the bank that had swallowed his savings and left him with nothing, thought about Dahl's potatoes and Dahl's guarantee on the stove, help given when he had no way to repay it. "I had $4, he said. "I built a cabin for $4 because someone helped me when I had nothing. This is how I repay it." Makinen nodded slowly. He understood debts like that. Everyone on the frontier understood debts like that. By fall, 5 new cordwood structures were rising across Oconto County. By the following spring, there were 12. Gustav Lindquist found Arne at the general store in April. The snow had melted. The mud had dried. Spring was settling over the county like a benediction, and settlers who had spent the winter huddled in their shelters were emerging to repair, rebuild, and start again. Arne was purchasing flour and salt, staples for the coming months, bought with money earned through odd jobs over the winter. He had worked for Dahl, helped Knutson repair his damaged chinking, done whatever labor was offered by anyone who would pay. His arm had healed, though it ached in cold weather. His ribs no longer pained him. The frostbite on his ears and cheeks had scarred over, leaving patches of pale, shiny skin. Lindquist stood behind his counter, watching. "You survived," he said, as Arne counted coins. "I did. I heard the stories. The woodpile house that held in the blizzard." Lindquist's voice carried no warmth. "I also heard Sten Halverson froze to death in his soddy 3 miles from here. Good construction did not save him." "No, it did not." Lindquist leaned forward, elbows on the counter. "You got lucky. 1 blizzard. 1 winter, that proves nothing. Any fool can stack firewood. Building properly takes skill." Arne looked at him. Lindquist had not changed, still prosperous, still certain, still dismissive of anything that challenged his understanding of how the world worked. He had bet money that the woodpile house would collapse by Christmas. He had lost that bet. But losing a bet was not the same as learning a lesson. "I am alive," Arne said. "Halverson is dead. His soddy was built properly." His soddy was built by a man who did not know what he was doing. That is different. "Is it?" Arne picked up his flour, his salt. "Knutson's cabin was built with 20 men. He burned 4 cords in the blizzard. 4 cords, and his wife's feet may never heal. I burned 1 cord, and I am standing here." Lindquist's face darkened. Knutson's chinking failed. That is not the cabin's fault. It is the cabin's design. Chinking fails. It fails every winter in every log cabin I have ever seen. The mortar in my walls does not fail. The mortar flexes instead of cracking. The sawdust insulates instead of conducting. The 16 inches hold heat instead of leaking it. You are a fool who got lucky. Nothing more. Arne shrugged. He had not expected conversion. Not from Lindquist, not ever. Some men could not be taught. Some men could only be outlasted. "My cabin is standing," he said. "Yours is not worth what you think it is. In 10 years, we will see which of us was the fool." He walked out before Lindquist could respond. The April sun was warm on his face, and somewhere behind him he could hear Lindquist sputtering, outraged, offended, unable to articulate what he felt. Lindquist never built a cordwood cabin. He never admitted Arne was right. He never spoke to Arne again, except in the clipped, minimal exchanges that business required. But he also never again offered to buy Arne's land for $8. The woodpile house stood as its own argument, and even Lindquist could not argue with walls that held through 41 below. By 1875, 12 cordwood structures stood in Oconto and Door counties. Arne had taught the technique to anyone who asked, and he had never charged a cent. The method spread the way useful knowledge always spreads among people who need it, hand to hand, family to family, neighbor to neighbor. Poor immigrants on cut-over land, settlers with no access to long, straight timber, families who could not afford milled lumber. These were the people who built with cordwood, because cordwood was what they had. Professor William Tischler, decades later, would document approximately 90 surviving 19th century cordwood buildings across Wisconsin. He would trace the technique to what he called hard scrabble settlements, places where settlers eked out a living by cutting railroad ties for 15 cents each, by shaving shingles, by doing whatever work the land and the season allowed. He would note that the oldest documented North American cordwood structure, built by a man named David Williams in 1848, had stood for 102 years before demolition. The woodpile houses did not collapse. They outlasted the log cabins built by 20 men. They outlasted the frame houses that cost $500. They lasted because the physics was sound, because the design was elegant, because 16 inches of wood and mortar and sawdust did exactly what Arne had calculated they would do. The neighbors had laughed. The neighbors had been wrong. Arne slept back, lived on his 40 acres for the rest of his life. In 1876, he married a Norwegian widow named Anna Olsen. She was 34, strong-featured and practical, with 2 children from her first marriage, a boy of 9 named Lars and a girl of 7 named Ingrid. Her husband had died of cholera in 74, leaving her with the children and a farm she could not work alone. She sold the farm, moved in with her sister in Menominee, and waited for something to change. Arne met her at a church social in the spring of 76. They talked about Norway, about the old country neither of them would ever see again. They talked about loss, his wife, her husband, the children she had buried before these 2 survived. By fall, they were married. Anna moved into the cordwood cabin with her children. The 12 by 16 space was cramped for 4 people, but they made it work. Lars slept in the loft Arne built above the main room. Ingrid shared a curtain corner with her mother. Arne slept wherever there was space. In 1879, Arne built a larger house, 20 feet by 24, with 16-inch cordwood walls like the original. 2 proper bedrooms, a larger main room, a real kitchen with a cook stove Anna chose herself. He built it in a single summer with help from Eric Dahl and 2 other men he had taught, settlers who were repaying their own debts, the way Arne had repaid his. The original cabin became a workshop. Arne used it for tools, for lumber storage, for the endless small projects that frontier life required. Anna used it for preserving, a cool, dark space where vegetables and meat could be stored through the winter. The workshop stood until 1912, when a lightning strike finally brought it down. 63 years from construction to destruction, longer than any log cabin built the same year, longer than most frame houses, longer even than the trees it was made from had stood before the loggers came. Arne died in 1894, age 54, of pneumonia that would not break. He worked until the last week, He was not a man who knew how to stop, and when the fever finally took him, he was sitting in a chair Anna had placed by the window, looking out at the land he had saved with $4 and stubbornness and 16 inches of wood. They buried him in the Norwegian Lutheran Cemetery in Oconto County, next to Marta, beneath a stone that gave only his name and dates. Anna lived another 12 years in the Cordwood house he had built for her. Lars and Ingrid raised families of their own, moved to cities, came back to visit when they could. The larger Cordwood house stood for 30 years after Arne's death. It sheltered Anna through her widowhood, sheltered her grandchildren during summer visits, sheltered whoever needed a roof and a warm fire and walls that would not fail. When progress finally demanded something newer, when the old house was torn down to make way for a modern structure, the workers who demolished it marveled at what they found. The mortar had not cracked. The wood had not rotted. After 50 years, the walls were still solid. They did not understand what they were destroying. They did not know the story of the man who built it. They only knew that whoever had stacked these strange walls, whoever had mixed this mortar and laid these rounds, had known something about building that had been forgotten since. Osarm. On January 7th, 1873, the temperature dropped 50 degrees in 4 hours. The blizzard lasted 3 days. Winds of 70 miles per hour drove snow horizontal. Visibility dropped to 0, and the thermometer fell to 41 degrees below 0. Over 70 people died across the upper Midwest. Men and women and children who froze in their shelters or lost their way between house and barn, or simply gave up when the cold became more than flesh could bear. Sten Halvorsen died 100 yards from his own door, reaching for a home he would never reach. Knutsen's wife lost feeling in her feet that she would never fully regain. A hired man at the Lindquist farm spent 6 hours trying to open a barn door, his frozen hands unable to work the latch. And Arne Sletback sat in his cordwood cabin, feeding his stove twice a day, watching his breath fog an air that stayed above freezing because his walls would not let the cold in. Halvor Knutsen had said, "A man alone cannot raise walls before the freeze. You will die out there, and no one will find your body until spring." Arne Sletback raised those walls alone. He raised them with 1 axe and 1 bucksaw and $4 in cash. He raised them with wood no sawmill would touch, crooked pieces and short pieces, and timber that the loggers had left behind as worthless. He raised them with mortar he made himself, from lime he burned himself, on land everyone said would never support a living. The walls did not collapse. He did not die. And when Knutsen came looking for a body, he found a man warming his hands by a stove in a cabin built from firewood and lime, with walls 16 inches thick that held 30 degrees of difference between inside and out. The walls held at 41 below 0 in 70-mile-per-hour winds for 3 days and 3 nights. They held because the wood breathed, and the mortar sealed, and the sawdust trapped dead air that would not conduct cold. They held because Arne Sletback understood something that the skeptics did not, that the land gives you what you need if you are willing to see it differently. His neighbors called it a woodpile house. They said it would collapse by Christmas. They bet money against him and waited for the storm that would prove them right. The storm came. The house stood. Arne Sletback's cordwood cabin, the impossible shelter, the fool's project, the woodpile that everyone laughed at, outlasted every log cabin built that same year. It outlasted the skeptics who mocked it. It outlasted the bank that took his savings and the mill that discarded him. It outlasted, in the end, even Arne himself. He had $4. He had no neighbors within 3 miles. He had timber no one else would touch. And he built a house that stood for 63 years.